The Alaska meeting between President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin was never expected to produce a ceasefire. Yet its significance lies not in absence of an agreement, but in the clarity of what was and was not possible, and in the stark reminder that the war in Ukraine remains one of the most intractable conflicts of the 21st century. The United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio, speaking in the immediate aftermath, articulated what has become the defining framework of this diplomatic effort. America is not the combatant. This is not Washington's war. It is a war between Russia and Ukraine, and only those two nations can decide on the territorial concessions, the security guarantees, and the political compromises that would end it. The conversation in Alaska narrowed the issue set. That in itself is progress. The questions are now clearly defined. Where will territorial lines be drawn? What form will long-term security guarantees for Ukraine take? What military alliances will Kyiv be permitted to enter? Each of these questions touches directly upon sovereignty, national pride, and geopolitical influence. Each carries implications that extend far beyond the battlefield, for they will shape the European balance of power for decades to come. The war has endured for over 3.5 years, precisely because none of these issues can be easily resolved. They are existential questions for both sides. President Trump did not initiate this war. He inherited it, a reality Secretary Rubio underscored repeatedly, yet he has made peace a priority of his administration. From Southeast Asia to Africa, his government has brokered settlements and reduced tensions in ways that eluded his predecessors. Ukraine, however, is the hardest test. It is a conflict rooted in centuries of contested identity, in the strategic geography of the Eurasian plain, and in Russia's enduring fear of encirclement. Ending it requires more than battlefield advantage. It requires altering the calculus of national survival on both sides. Europe hovers uneasily around this negotiation. European governments are asked to provide security guarantees, yet they remain dependent on Russian energy flows, both directly through natural gas and indirectly through oil refined in China and resold into European markets. Sanctions packages circulate in Brussels, but energy dependency limits the severity of what can be imposed. That dependence weakens the collective European hand and leaves Washington as the only actor with true leverage over both Kyiv and Moscow. Yet, leverage without legitimacy is useless. And legitimacy can only be achieved when both warring parties accept that the United States can facilitate a deal neither side likes, but both can live with. The stakes are not confined to Ukraine. Russia has transformed its economy into a wartime system, allocating industrial output to sustain a prolonged struggle. Ukraine has mobilized its population and continues to rely heavily on Western military support. Every month that passes deepens the human and material cost, hardens public opinion, and narrows the space for compromise. The Secretary of State warned that the war is only going to get worse, not better. Without a negotiated end, escalation is inevitable, and escalation in a European theater risks consequences beyond calculation. This explains why the Alaska meeting mattered, even without breakthrough. Meeting in person allowed leaders to gauge resolve in ways that telephone calls cannot. It created the conditions for follow-up discussions in Washington, where President Volodymyr Zelensky will meet both President Trump and European heads of state. That gathering could prove pivotal. It will center on the most sensitive question of all: security guarantees. Ukraine will not accept a peace that merely pauses the war and allows Russia to return in 2 or 3 years. Kyiv demands mechanisms that would deter renewed aggression. Such mechanisms, however, carry immense cost. A United States commitment would be a concession of extraordinary magnitude, signaling that Washington is willing to tie its credibility to the defense of a nation outside of NATO. Even a partial guarantee would represent a transformation in European security architecture. Secretary Rubio framed the negotiation in stark terms. A peace deal requires both sides to surrender something. If one side gains everything, the result is not peace, it is surrender. Neither Russia nor Ukraine appears ready to surrender. That is why progress, however incremental, matters. Narrowing the disputes, clarifying the non-negotiables, and reducing the scope of contention are the only steps that can eventually create conditions for the three leaders, Trump, Putin, and Zelensky, to meet together. Without such groundwork, any summit would collapse into rhetoric and recrimination. Europe's role remains ambiguous. On one hand, European states seek greater security assurances for Ukraine. On the other, they remain reluctant to fully sever economic ties with Moscow. Secondary sanctions that target Russian oil sales to China and the subsequent resale into Europe would dramatically increase costs for European consumers. Thus, while Washington debates tariffs and secondary sanctions, Europe resists escalation that would destabilize its own economies. Yet, paradoxically, Europe also insists on being part of the security solution. This contradiction illustrates the broader dilemma of the continent. Dependent on Washington's power, constrained by its own vulnerabilities, and caught between the imperatives of deterrence and economic stability. The question of timelines adds further complexity. There is no ceasefire now, nor any guarantee that talks will yield one. At some point, President Trump will need to decide whether the investment of time and political capital remains justified. Sanctions can always be intensified, but such actions would eliminate the possibility of dialogue. The Secretary of State was explicit. Once Washington escalates to maximum sanctions, negotiations are over for the foreseeable future. Putin will not meet with Macron, nor with the United Kingdom's leadership. Only one figure in the world has the ability to bring the two sides to the same table, and that is President Trump. If that role is forfeited, the war will continue unchecked, and casualties will mount into the tens of thousands. Behind this diplomacy lies a harsher truth. Wars are not only fought for territory, they are fought for economic survival and strategic leverage. Ukraine's rare earth mineral deposits, critical for future technologies, represent one of the prizes of this conflict. Control of these resources would shape both reconstruction and integration into Western markets. Russia's bombardment of regions linked to these deposits demonstrates that Moscow understands their importance. Yet even here, the United States views its role not as fighting for resource access, but as mediating a peace that prevents further devastation. America has other sources of rare earth minerals. For Ukraine, however, these resources are central to post-war survival. Thus, the battle over territory is also a battle over the future economic independence of Kyiv. The global implications are immense. If the war drags on, Western support for Ukraine will strain under domestic pressures. Energy prices, inflationary cycles, and political fatigue in Europe will all undermine solidarity. Russia, while damaged by sanctions, has adapted through deeper integration with China, India, and other states willing to purchase discounted energy. The longer the conflict continues, the more entrenched these alternative trade patterns become. The war therefore accelerates the fragmentation of the global economy into competing blocs, one orbiting around Washington, the other around Beijing and Moscow. This is why the Alaska meeting, though lacking spectacle, represents a decisive moment. It confirms that dialogue remains possible, that channels remain open, and that Washington still occupies the central seat at the table of European security. It also highlights the fragility of the process. One miscalculation, one escalation too far, and the window for negotiation closes. The Secretary of State made clear that peace may not be possible. Yet if it is possible, only one leader has the capacity to achieve it. That is the harsh reality of 2025. As the world watches, the next stage unfolds in Washington. President Zelensky, invited by President Trump, will arrive with selected European heads of state. They will discuss the contours of security guarantees, the concessions each side might bear, and the role of Europe in underwriting a fragile peace. The President of the United States has already consulted the Secretary General of NATO, maintaining constant coordination with allies. The outcome of these conversations will determine whether momentum exists toward a three-party summit or whether the conflict descends back into unrestrained escalation. In the end, this is the paradox of American power. The war in Ukraine does not directly affect daily life in the United States. Gasoline prices, employment figures, domestic debates. These are not determined by the outcome of battles near Donetsk or Luhansk. Yet, the United States remains the only actor capable of steering this conflict toward resolution. That asymmetry is both a burden and a demonstration of leadership. President Trump's decision to devote substantial time to a distant war illustrates his strategic calculation. Peace in Ukraine, however elusive, is a cornerstone of global stability. If it can be achieved, the dividends will be felt across Europe, Asia, and beyond. If it cannot, then the world must brace for a protracted confrontation that will shape the century. Thus, the Alaska meeting closes not with triumph, but with sober clarity. The war continues. The path to peace remains narrow. The stakes rise with every passing month. And the geopolitical balance of the 21st century hangs, in part, on whether Washington can turn fragile dialogues into a durable settlement. History suggests that such outcomes are never inevitable. They are constructed through relentless effort, painful compromise, and the recognition that peace is never achieved when one side demands everything. Peace is achieved when both sides accept less than they desire and more than they feared they would lose. That is the logic of negotiation. That is the logic of survival. And that is the logic that now guides the only leader with the credibility to attempt what others cannot.